Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about what I see as the promises and peril of intellectual history, more specifically of global intellectual history. A decade ago, a group of scholars who work on the intellectual history of various parts of the world and from various traditions came together under the umbrella of global intellectual history. This was first a conference, attempting to move beyond what they saw as the parochialism of each of their subfields. They took on the ambitious task of defining or redefining what the practice of global intellectual history might look like. Their project, explicitly anti-Eurocentric in nature, sought to take seriously the intellectual contributions of parts of the world that are commonly taken as political, social, or economic objects, especially in the American university system, where area studies models continue to weigh heavily on research agendas. Right? In this segment, I look to explain the value of their contribution, the criticisms made of it, and some of the ways that I see the field going forward. For indeed, it is a field that promises to stay around. The conference Global Intellectual History, which in many ways launched this field, took place in April of 2010, now 10 years ago. The edited volume by Samuel Moyn and Andrew Sartori, largely based on the proceedings, was published by Columbia University Press in 2013. Subsequently, an entire journal came into existence with the same name, although based at a different institution, in this case in the UK. And even if most practitioners of the field identify first and foremost with their own regional subfield, let's say European, Asian, African, or Latin American intellectual history, to name just a few, the global dimension of these projects and the connections between them are increasingly manifest in scholarship. Part of this may lie in what some critics have seen as a pressure for scholars to market their work as transnational, global, transimperial, etc., but it also points to a fruitful realm of inquiry and a set of questions that have reshaped intellectual history writ large. It's clear that with the massive increase in historical and social scientific research, intellectual history was bound to cover parts of the world such as India, East Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, where there had been a lacuna. These regions had all too often been studied in the U.S. in particular as objects rather than as intellectual cultures in their own right, with agency to shape global conversations, whether it be in the early modern period, the 19th century, or into the present. The Cold War narrative of Western civilization is largely responsible for this, a strange teleology that worked its way from the Greeks and Romans, the ancients, through the Renaissance and into European high modernity. This model simply became unsustainable as scholars filled out the historical record and increasingly did work in local languages all across the globe. And I think this is particularly the case in the history of science, as I will return to. At a very basic level, and this is coming back to Sartori and Moyn, intellectual history as a field would, I quote, attend to non-Western intellectual histories with a rigor commensurate with the scholarship on Western intellectual histories, unquote. Of course, the category of the West that they use in this Western intellectual history is itself problematic, but I think that the editors themselves would grant this, right? They're not trying to reinforce these dichotomies, but rather to break them down. Few would contend, I think, that their argument at a basic level of broadening the subjects of intellectual history beyond what Tyler Stovall has called the attention to dead white males, few would question this aspect of their argument. And every time I think of this, I just remember from my time studying in New York, going to Columbia's Butler Library and seeing the names of the ancients, Homer, Herodotus, Sophocles, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, inscribed on this building, right? This is the tradition that we're getting away in doing global intellectual history. The editors of Global Intellectual History make it clear, however, that it's not only new empirical work that was lacking. According to them, a methodological and historiographical reorientation was needed, or at least an invitation to reflect on the possibilities for the field as a whole. Since the publication of this volume, we have seen fascinating studies published on the importance of Mexican artists for modern art in the United States, the invaluable contribution made by people of color in the Caribbean and elsewhere to modern medicine, and indigenous intellectuals in the early modern state formation process. And this is just to name a few examples of the ways that global intellectual history has come to take place in Latin American history, which I know the best. Examples such as these empirically demonstrate the validity of global intellectual approaches and challenge Eurocentric understandings of the directionality of the flow of ideas coming from Europe and going elsewhere. In fact, it was much more complicated than that in every instance. But without further ado, it's worth stopping to consider the options outlined by the authors themselves, that is, Moyne and Sartori, or as they put it, I quote, the gallery of alternative models, unquote. First of all, we should say that the very idea of a gallery represents a pluralism and even eclecticism that brings into question the unified nature of this project. For some, this might be seen as a flaw, but it's also an important source for further debate as the field continues to develop, and it will. The first model that they outlined for global intellectual history is considering the globe as a quote-unquote meta-analytic category of the historian. Crudely speaking, what they mean by this is that doing intellectual history means taking on world history as a whole in its entirety, in its totality, writing what is commonly known as universal history. At least this is what it was known as to Enlightenment thinkers, of which Hegel is perhaps the most prominent. Beyond the problems associated with this method of Eurocentrism, right, writing the history of the world from the history of Europe, there's also the very real problem of specificity and attention to local conditions. It's the pure hubris of the intellectual to pretend to know the entirety of the world at a given time, let alone the entirety of world history. Few nowadays would consider this a valid approach, especially with the very real problems of sources and languages. But the global need not encompass the entirety of the globe. It should be at least, and here I'm quoting Moyne and Sartori, the substantive scale of a historical process, unquote. Just as Fernand Braudel considered the interconnected economic system between the Mediterranean, North Africa, Northern Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America, we might do the same in intellectual history without succumbing to the world system model dear to Emanuel Wallerstein. What's obvious, as the authors identify in the first paragraph of their introduction, is that the objects of intellectual history are in some ways the most likely and best candidates for doing global history. And I quote them, "These thinkers and concepts were presumably some of those most amenable to spread across vast geographical spaces," unquote. Surely, highly educated and traveled people across the centuries have come to understand the globe, the world, the earth, and its societies, however we want to put it, on their own terms, and we might consider their conceptions of what the globe was as part of intellectual history. This is one way of doing global intellectual history, as we've seen in recent years with the likes of Quinn Slobodian's book, Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism. For me, one of the most important contributions of this volume, this is Global Intellectual History, is to consider intermediaries, translators, and networks as part of intellectual history. This means departing from an internalist view of intellectual history that emphasizes almost exclusively texts, intentions, and meaning, and allows us to look at new approaches that shed light on every field, from art history to literature to the history of medicine and the social sciences, to name just a few. It's not only that intellectuals connected different parts of the world through their writing and their activity, they were part of an interconnected world, whether or well before the globalization of the 1890s, the 1990s, or even the 1500s. Part of our task, I think, in reconstructing canons, the kinds of texts that we find useful and interesting for students to be reading, is to consider the importance of mediators and networks, especially when knowledge, ideas, and practices flowed not just from the north-south, but from what we tend to think of as the global south to the north. Vanessa Smith's article in this volume, Joseph Banks' Intermediaries, does this quite effectively. By examining the celebrated naturalist and his native informants in the South Pacific, Smith considers their contributions to British science, all too often written out of the historical narrative. Suffice it to say here that this approach has been particularly important in the history of science, whether in considering Alexander von Humboldt's travels, particularly in the Americas, Henry Louis Bates in the Amazon, here I'm thinking of Hugh Raffles' book, In Amazonia, or Pablo Gomez's The Experiential Caribbean, Creating Knowledge and Healing in the Early Modern Atlantic. Arguably, every single great thinker or intellectual can be approached in this light. In just a few months, we'll see the publication of and have the pleasure of reading Amin Perez's book, Faire de la politique avec la sociologie, Abdelmalek Sayad et Pierre Bourdieu dans la guerre d'Algérie. This promising book considers the work of Pierre Bourdieu alongside the Algerian Abdelmalek Sayad and others in Algeria. As far as I know, the best statement of the field for this kind of work, this is looking at mediators and intermediaries, can actually be found in Brazil. Angela de Castro Gomes and Patricia Santos Hansen recently published a book called Intelectuais Mediadores in 2016, largely dealing with Brazil, but extremely relevant to the questions that we're talking about here and that have been explored in this book, Global Intellectual History. In my view, all of this fits nicely with what Sanjay Subrahmanyan has called connected history, even if he, incidentally, is one of the most vocal critics of this book at hand. Subrahmanyan's review, Global Intellectual History Beyond Hegel and Marx, takes the edited volume to task for its eclecticism, its lack of attention to the history of intellectual exchange prior to the 19th century, and what he sees as a persistent Eurocentrism, even if the volume itself is explicitly trying to combat this kind of Eurocentrism. The problem, in my view, has more to do with academic geographies and personalities, in this case Subrahmanyan being based in Paris at the Collège de France, these authors mostly being in New York, as it does with the content or the method at stake. As Subrahmanyan says so himself at the end of his review, I quote, 9 of the 13 contributors are from New York, a curiously parochial profile for an ostensibly global reflection, unquote. Still, I think it is worth considering the intellectual critiques that he makes, so as to continue to move the field, and this very promising field, forward. For Subrahmanyan, I think the major problem with the volume is its restricted chronological scope, something which negatively affects not only its content, but also its analytic rigor. Subrahmanyan, one of the most eminent historians of early modern Asia, has argued for the importance of long-distance travel, circulation, and knowledge accumulation across spaces that were often considered to have no relationship to one another. He spans the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, reaching as far as Western Europe and also into Japan, in which the figures he studies circulated, right? The difference between his work and the contributors to this volume is that it deals mostly with religion, poetics, and other forms rather than political economy per se, which we should remember did not yet exist in, say, the 16th century. In the realm of politics and the economy, the world was arguably not as connected as it is in the 19th and 20th centuries, but that does not mean that connections were inexistent in other areas or at other times. In the words of Subramanian, I quote, "The centuries before 1800 received stepmotherly treatment in this volume." But simply adding a few entries prior to 1800 would not be enough. According to him, Hegel and Marx, both German thinkers from the 19th century, loom too large in the mental categories of the organizers. The problem is not only that the theory to be applied elsewhere is located in Europe. Subramanian cast doubt on the subaltern approaches to Hegel and other European thinkers that see him as Eurocentric and therefore unable to contribute to a conversation about world history. It's instead that the real problem, the crux of this, is that we're using categories from our own era to analyze eras distinct from ours and before ours. If I understand it correctly, it is to say that Hegel and Marx might be extremely useful for analyzing the 18th through 20th century, especially in Europe, but that before that we're entering into murkier water. To give credit to the authors, this is Moyne and Sartori, their work outside of this volume, even when it is closely indebted to Marx, is based upon local conditions and archives. They challenge diffusionist theories and models according to which Europe is the center of global history tout court, or global intellectual history more specifically. Andrew Sartori, for example, has analyzed how the concept of culture or liberal ideology emerged within colonial Bengal and South Asia. The logics of the means of production, in this case, including plebeian private property, rather than see Marx or Locke as intellectuals that produce categories and ways of being, he sees them as the kind of epiphenomenon of this broader political and economic change of the 19th century. As he so effectively puts it, and this is in his book Liberalism and Empire, a peasant not need to have read Locke to be Lockean. Subramanian's critique certainly serves to further open the field of intellectual history beyond the modern period and beyond Western Europe. It continues to clarify the kinds of work that global intellectual history, or as he might call it, connected intellectual history, might take as its object. But if anything, criticism is healthy and keeps the field moving forward. The efforts of the editors and the contributors to global intellectual history, I think, have not been in vain. Global intellectual history is here to stay. Surely, for the immediate future, global circulation has come to a halting stop. But if conference circuits are closed for the time being, it might also be time to reflect on the inequalities of global intellectual exchange so as to move towards a more inclusive vision of global history as we move forward. We're entering an era of new challenges, to be sure, but also one with potential to reconfigure old paradigms and refresh our methodological approaches a decade later. But perhaps first, before we continue to move forward in these methodological conversations, we would do well to take this time to better understand the local dynamics of global intellectual history before we come together once again. Thank you for listening to me today, and have a great afternoon.